Picture a room so vast its ceiling is lost in a mist of artificial light, a chamber where beings from 1,000 stars gather in silent judgment. This is the grand assembly of the Galactic Federation, the pinnacle of cosmic power and arrogance. And in the center of it all stands one man, Ambassador Thorne, alone, holding nothing more than a data slate containing what he called humanity's gift. The air was thick with condescension, a palpable wave of alien amusement that manifested as a chorus of derisive clicks and mocking hisses from the assembled delegates. Thorne spoke of our Universal Compatibility Protocol, a piece of Earth technology born from a simple, desperate idea, and the response was a universal sneer. The Vorlax delegate, a creature of shimmering scales and cold, black eyes, delivered the crushing verdict that echoed the feelings of every advanced species in the room. You offer a stone axe to masters of plasma steel. In that moment, we weren't just considered primitive, we were a joke. A punchline to a galactic joke no one had bothered to tell us. But what our new galactic overlords failed to understand, what their eons of superior technology had blinded them to, was the unique genius of humanity. We have never been the first to invent something. We weren't the first to discover fire or the wheel or even flight. Our history is not one of pristine, isolated discovery, but of chaotic, beautiful, relentless adaptation. We are the ultimate integrators. We find broken things, outdated things, things from completely different systems that were never meant to work together, and we find a way. We make them talk, we build bridges where others see only chasms, and that data slate, that so-called stone axe, was the greatest bridge humanity had ever attempted to build. It wasn't a weapon, it was a key designed to fit every lock in the galaxy because it was built by a species that had spent its entire history picking locks. This is the story of that desperate gamble. It's a story about the quiet power of simplicity in the face of overwhelming complexity. It's about the moment the laughter stopped, not because we built a bigger gun, but because we understood a fundamental truth they had forgotten, that the most advanced system has the most vulnerabilities, and the humblest tool in the right hands can become the most powerful weapon. This is the journey into one of humanity's finest hours, a tale of technological cunning and sheer, unadulterated nerve that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. So stay with us as we explore how they laughed at Earth tech, right up until the very second it reached out and hacked their entire fleet. The grand, echoing chamber of the assembly faded behind Ambassador Thorne, replaced by the low hum of aging life support and the faint scent of ozone. The Earth Embassy was a testament to galactic indifference, a cramped module clinging to the outer hull of the Federation's central station, its metal walls scuffed and its lighting a perpetually dim yellow. Thorne let the heavy door hiss shut, the silence inside a stark contrast to the chorus of alien mockery. He didn't need to speak. Slumped in a worn chair before a bank of flickering monitors was Kaito, his fingers dancing across a keyboard with a frantic, focused energy. The main screen displayed a cascade of data streams, lines of code in a dozen different alien protocols flowing into a central, pulsing green node labeled UCP. Thorne simply loosened his formal collar, the gesture heavy with the weight of their public failure. He expected to see confirmation of their defeat on the screens, the final log of a rejected data packet. But Kaito wasn't looking at a rejection notice. He was tracking something else entirely, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning triumph. "They took the bait," Kaito murmured, his voice a low crackle of static in the quiet room. He didn't turn away from the screen. The handshake was accepted. It was buried under layers of their own diagnostic scans, probably automated, but it was a full authentication query. Thorne moved closer, the diplomatic mask of calm finally slipping to reveal the raw tension beneath. "What are you seeing, Kaito?" The data on the screen was a chaotic ballet of symbols, but one stream was highlighted, a continuous pulse of information flowing from a source identified only by a complex alphanumeric tag. Kaito tapped the screen, his finger tracing the path of the data. That tag, it's not a civilian address. That's the primary traffic control nexus for the Federation's core defense fleet. Their entire system, from dreadnoughts to patrol frigates, just reached out and politely asked our little server for its identification papers. He finally swiveled in his chair to face Thorne, a slow, sharp smile cutting across his face. "Sir, the back door is open." They looked at our stone axe, scoffed, and then brought it right into the heart of their armory. They're inside our system, and in doing so, they've given us the keys to theirs. The quiet declaration hung in the air, transforming the shabby embassy from a symbol of human insignificance into the command center for the most audacious counterstroke in history. The laughter in the Grand Assembly hadn't been the end of the story. It was merely the distraction that allowed the real work to begin. Deep within the command nexus of the Vorlax flagship, a vessel so colossal it cast a shadow like a small moon, a single indicator flickered from serene blue to a cautious amber. The tactical officer, a being whose multi-jointed limbs were poised over a holographic display of pristine, ordered data streams, registered the anomaly with barely a flicker of attention. It was a minor power fluctuation, a spike in background radiation emanating from the third planet of the Sol system. With a dismissive tap of a clawed digit, he logged the event and appended the standard classification for such disturbances from undeveloped worlds. Insignificant, he reported to the empty, silent bridge. Primitive solar flare activity. The system's automated filters have already compensated. The alert vanished from the main screen, buried in a log of 1,000 other routine events, deemed utterly unworthy of a second thought. Light years away, in a darkened room on Earth, that flicker of amber light was a supernova. Kaito let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the tension in his shoulders dissolving into a wave of pure, electrifying relief. On his screen, a different log was displayed, one written in the clandestine language of the Universal Compatibility Protocol. It showed a successful, unsolicited connection to a Vorlax reconnaissance drone, designated Scout Class Hunter-Killer, tail number 739er. For exactly 3.2 seconds, Kaito had held the drone's navigational and weapons systems in a virtual vice grip. He hadn't fired a shot, he hadn't altered its course, he had simply issued a single benign command, a diagnostic request for its tertiary sensor array. The drone had complied instantly, automatically, before the UCP seamlessly released its hold and erased all traces of the intrusion. To the Vorlax flagship's sophisticated AI, it was nothing more than a momentary system glitch, a hiccup in the data flow easily attributed to stellar interference. This was the crucial difference between their technological philosophies. The Federation systems were built like majestic, impenetrable fortresses, designed to withstand a direct assault from a peer adversary. They had walls a mile high and gates of polished neutronium, but humanity's creation wasn't a battering ram, it was a whisper. The UCP didn't try to break down the gates, it mimicked the voice of the gatekeeper. It spoke the exact, perfect language of the Vorlax internal network protocols because it had learned that language during the very first handshake. When the Federation fleet had probed the UCP, trying to assess its simplistic structure, they had unknowingly given it a complete dictionary of their own security dialects. Kaito's test wasn't an attack, it was a conversation. He had politely asked a Vorlax drone a question in flawless Vorlax, and the drone, conditioned to respond to authorized queries, had answered without a moment's suspicion. The greatest weakness of their hyper-advanced, interconnected fleet wasn't a flaw in their armor plating or their shield emitters. It was their absolute, unshakable faith in the sanctity of their own network. They never considered that someone might simply learn to knock politely and be invited inside. The scheduled war games commenced with a theatrical brilliance meant to cow any primitive observer. A full Vorlax battle group, a constellation of predatory shapes forged from dark, energy-absorbent alloys, dropped out of superluminal travel near the gas giant Jupiter. Their arrival was a silent, ominous ripple in space-time, but their subsequent maneuvers were anything but quiet. On an unencrypted channel, a blatant and insulting display of confidence, the Vorlax fleet began a complex ballet of destruction. Dreadnoughts weaved between the orbits of Jupiter's moons, their main guns firing simulated volleys that lit up sensors with phantom energies. Swarms of smaller attack craft performed intricate, razor-sharp formations, a demonstration of coordination so perfect it felt more like a single organism than a collection of individual ships. And all of it was accompanied by the voice of Commander Zalk. His transmissions, laced with a guttural pride, boomed across the open frequency, each word deliberately chosen for human listening posts. Formation Sigma 9, execute flanking run on the fourth moon. Let the apes see the precision of true power, he would command, his tone dripping with condescension. Another transmission followed. Weapons test on asteroidal debris. Note the complete vaporization. This is the difference between a spark and a star. To Zalk and his crew, this was more than a military exercise. It was a performance for an audience they considered beneath notice, a way to reinforce the galactic pecking order through sheer, overwhelming spectacle. They were not just practicing for war, they were advertising their invincibility. Meanwhile, in a shielded data center buried deep beneath the Alps, Kaito's creation was feasting. Every boast from Zalk, every vector change of a warship, every power signature from a weapon discharge, it was all being captured. The unencrypted channel was a fire hose of priceless intelligence, and Kaito's AI was drinking every drop. But it wasn't just recording the data passively. The AI, built on the foundational logic of the Universal Compatibility Protocol, was cross-referencing every piece of information. It was learning. It mapped Zalk's command style aggressive, predictable, reliant on brute force. It analyzed the response times of his ships, identifying which vessels were quicker to react and which lagged by microseconds, revealing potential weak points in their network. It cataloged the unique energy signatures of every weapon system, every engine type, every shield frequency. The AI wasn't just building a database, it was constructing a perfect digital twin of the entire Vorlax battle group. It understood their tactical doctrines, their communication patterns, and most critically, the intricate hierarchy of their machine language. Each transmission was a language lesson, teaching the AI the subtle dialects of command and control that govern the fleet. Commander Zalk, in his arrogance, was providing a live, narrated tutorial on exactly how to defeat his own forces. He believed he was showcasing an unbridgeable gap in technology and might. In reality, he was handing his enemy the complete schematic for his own downfall, every boastful transmission another brick removed from the wall of his technological superiority. The apes were indeed watching, but they were not cowering. They were learning, calculating, and preparing a response that would be born not of raw power, but of perfect, intimate understanding. For all its grand spectacle, the flaw that would unravel the Vorlax fleet wasn't hidden in their weaponry, but in the mundane complexity of their own technology. During a high-velocity pass by the volcanic moon Io, a lone scout ship designated Hunter-Killer 739er experienced a problem so trivial it was barely worth noting in the ship's log. A fractional miscalculation in its navigational computer, a corrupted data bit likely caused by Jupiter's intense radiation belts, caused the vessel to drift a few dozen meters off its programmed course. To the ship's AI, it was a simple error to be corrected on the next system cycle, but to the crew it was utterly imperceptible, lost in the vast, automated precision of their vessel's operation. The ship was now on a trajectory that would, in approximately 47 seconds, bring it dangerously close to a jagged outcrop of rock, a near miss that would have been logged as a minor incident if it was noticed at all. In the Alpine Data Center, however, it was a 5-alarm fire. Kaito's AI, which maintained a constant, silent vigil on the fleet's telemetry, flagged the anomaly instantly. A red warning bloomed on his main screen, highlighting the scout ship's deviation and projecting its new path straight into the moon's unforgiving crust. This was no simulated test. This was a real ship with a real crew heading for a very real impact. For a heartbeat, Kaito froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had the power to intervene. The Universal Compatibility Protocol had already mapped the scout ship's command pathways with intimate detail. He could send a command, a tiny packet of data that would look to the ship's computer, exactly like a routine course correction from the Vorlax flagship itself. The decision was made not in seconds, but in a fraction of one. This wasn't an act of war, it was an act of maintenance. With a few swift keystrokes, he composed a message in flawless Vorlax machine code. It was a simple navigational override containing the corrected coordinates. He masked its origin, routing it through a series of ghost nodes that made it appear to emanate from the fleet's own traffic control system. Then he sent it. The data packet traveled at the speed of light, slipping seamlessly into the stream of information flowing to the scout ship. On the bridge of Hunter-Killer 739er, the crew would have seen nothing more than a flicker on a secondary screen as their computer accepted the update and smoothly adjusted the ship's thrusters. The vessel veered gently back to its safe, intended course, clearing the rocky promontory with kilometers to spare. A moment later, a new line of text appeared in Kaito's log. It was an automated response from the scout ship's system, a standard acknowledgement signal sent after receiving any verified command. The message was brief and utterly devoid of emotion, a string of Vorlax alphanumerics that translated to a single, bureaucratic phrase, course correction verified. System nominal. There was no gratitude, no suspicion, just the cold, efficient confirmation of a machine that had received an instruction from an authority it was programmed to trust. But to Kaito, that sterile message was more valuable than any declaration of victory. It was proof of concept on a cosmic scale. He hadn't just hacked a system, he had performed a life-saving surgery on it, and the patient had thanked him without ever knowing he was there. The Vorlax believed their technology made them invincible. In that moment, Kaito understood that their very reliance on that technology, their blind faith in its perfection, had made them profoundly, vulnerably mortal. The stone axe had just been used to perform a task of impossible delicacy, and the masters of plasma steel were none the wiser. Ambassador Thorne's decision was not made lightly, yet it emerged from a newfound and profound understanding of their position. The successful, unseen correction of the scout ship's course was more than a technical victory. It was a philosophical one. It demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength was not in matching the Federation's power, but in manipulating the very fabric of their technological arrogance. In the quiet of the embassy, Thorne looked at the logs showing the Vorlax ship's bland acknowledgement, and he saw a path forward. It was a path of shadows and whispers, not of direct confrontation. He gave the authorization with a single, quietly spoken phrase that would define the next phase of their struggle: initiate Operation Ghost Hand. The objective was not destruction, but degradation. Not a knockout blow, but the slow, meticulous introduction of doubt. Kaito and his small, hand-picked team of digital artisans began their work with the patience of master watchmakers. Their target was the very symbol of Vorlax supremacy, Commander Zalk's own flagship, the colossal dreadnought Star Reaver. Their tool was the silent, invisible access granted by the Universal Compatibility Protocol. And their method was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as a systems glitch. Instead of seizing control or causing catastrophic failure, Kaito's team focused on the most critical system for a warrior culture: targeting. During the Star Reaver's daily simulated weapons drills, elaborate exercises where the ship would blast asteroids and holographic projections with terrifying precision, the Ghost Hand team would gently intervene. As the ship's powerful scanners locked onto a target, Kaito would introduce a minuscule, almost imperceptible amount of lag into the data stream between the targeting computer and the main gun arrays. It wasn't enough to make the shots miss entirely. It was just enough to make them slightly late. A volley of plasma that should have vaporized a target dead center would instead strike its outer edge. A simulated missile launch would register a hit, but the system would log a fractional delay in acquisition time. To the flagship's advanced diagnostic systems, these anomalies were virtually invisible, lost in the background noise of the ship's immense power output. They were written off as minor system fluctuations, the kind of thing any complex starship might experience. But to Commander Zalk, watching the results on his command bridge, they were an intolerable stain on his record. He saw not a technical fault, but a failure of discipline. His rage was immediate and visceral. Communications intercepted by the UCP revealed a commander unraveling. He would berate his weapons officers publicly over the ship's intercom, his voice a guttural roar of frustration. Incompetence, he would snarl. The targeting solution was perfect. Your sluggishness insults the entire battle group. He ordered double drills, punishing his crew for errors they did not commit, creating a corrosive atmosphere of suspicion and resentment within his own command. Each simulated drill became a theater of the absurd. Zalk's crew, striving for impossible perfection under the lash of their commander's anger, would grow more tense, more prone to making genuine, minor mistakes under the pressure. This only confirmed Zalk's belief in their incompetence, creating a vicious, self-fulfilling cycle. The Ghost Hand team, monitoring it all, would carefully adjust their interventions, ensuring the glitches were erratic and untraceable, always mimicking the kind of errors a tired or poorly trained crew might make. They were not just hacking a ship, they were hacking a commander's mind, exploiting his pride and his unwavering belief in the infallibility of his technology. The stone axe was no longer just a tool. It had become a chisel, being used to ever so carefully tap at the cracks in the foundation of Vorlax confidence, one tiny, frustrating lag spike at a time. The inevitable summons from the Vorlax High Command did not arrive with a blaring alarm, but as a single, encrypted data packet marked with the highest priority seal. It landed in Commander Zalk's personal command queue with the silent weight of a tombstone. The message itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic coldness, devoid of the theatrical rage Zalk himself favored. It contained no accusations, only a dry, factual summary of the war game performance metrics, highlighting the statistically anomalous decline in targeting efficiency and reaction times across his battle group. The final line was the most damning. Explain this degradation. High Command expects operational perfection. For a warrior whose entire identity was built upon an image of flawless, overwhelming force, those words were a direct challenge to his honor. The bridge of the Star Reaver, usually a place of disciplined silence, grew thick with a new, terrifying tension as Zalk absorbed the communique. The condescending confidence he had displayed for the human audience evaporated, replaced by the cold sweat of a commander whose career now hung by a thread. Zalk's reaction was precisely what Kaito's psychological profile had predicted, not thoughtful analysis but blind, furious panic. The commander erupted, his roar echoing through the cavernous bridge as he slammed a scaled fist onto his console. A full diagnostic. I want every circuit, every line of code, every thruster nozzle scanned. Now, he bellowed at his terrified crew. There is a flaw in my ship, and I will tear it out with my own claws. This was the critical moment, the pivot upon which the entire Ghost Hand operation turned. A full diagnostic by the Vorlax's own sophisticated systems was a real threat. It was designed to uncover even the most subtle intrusions. But Kaito had not been idle during the weeks of sowing discord. He had been preparing for this exact contingency, understanding that the Vorlax mindset, for all its technological prowess, was fundamentally linear. They would search for a physical, tangible fault, So he decided to give them one. Months earlier, during the initial silent probing phase, the UCP had not just been learning command protocols, it had been mapping the entire architecture of the Star Reaver's engineering subsystems. Kaito had identified a single, non-critical component buried deep within the secondary environmental control network, a coolant flow sensor for an auxiliary power relay. It was the kind of part that would never cause a catastrophic failure, but whose inaccurate readings could create a cascade of minor, seemingly unrelated system errors. In the dead of night by station time, Kaito's AI had woven a phantom into the ship's log. It created a perfect, fabricated history for this one sensor, showing it had begun to sporadically report inaccurate temperature data weeks ago. The false data was artfully designed to be just inconsistent enough to escape notice during routine checks, but blatantly obvious under the intense scrutiny of a Level 1 diagnostic. It was a digital sleight of hand, a single bad seed planted in a vast forest of data, waiting for the right conditions to be discovered. As the Star Reaver's engineering teams scrambled under Zalk's frantic orders, their powerful diagnostic suites swept through the ship's millions of subsystems. And just as Kaito had planned, the scan flags descended upon the corrupted coolant sensor like a pack of hounds on a scent. The chief engineer, a pragmatic Vorlax more concerned with mechanics than politics, presented the finding with relief. He had found the smoking gun. He explained to a seething Zalk how the faulty sensor's erroneous readings could have introduced minute power fluctuations into the secondary grid, which in turn could have caused timing delays in the sensitive targeting computers. It was a technically plausible, if somewhat convoluted, chain of events, exactly the kind of frustrating, gremlin-like fault that could bedevil even the most advanced technology. Zalk, desperate for a scapegoat that wasn't his own command ability, seized upon the explanation with grim satisfaction. He didn't see a brilliant misdirection, he saw a defective part, an insult to his ship's perfection that could be physically removed and replaced. The order was given to purge the sensor and its entire data history, effectively erasing the very evidence of Kaito's manipulation. In his rage to fix a problem, Commander Zalk had personally destroyed the only clue that could have led him to the real one, cementing his belief in a technical glitch while the true architect of his troubles watched from light years away, his presence now more ghostly than ever. With the Star Reaver effectively blinded by its own intensive diagnostics, Kaito was presented with an opportunity he knew might never come again. The entire battle group, for a brief but critical window, was operating in a state of heightened but inwardly focused security. Their sensors were turned inward, probing their own systems for the phantom fault Zalk was so determined to find, creating a temporary blind spot in their external network vigilance. It was the digital equivalent of a master locksmith becoming so obsessed with a single, stubborn lock on his own front door that he fails to notice someone quietly stepping into his study. Kaito decided it was time to step inside. The target was not a weapons system or an engine core. It was something far more valuable, the fleet's logistical and administrative core, the seemingly mundane database that handled everything from crew duty rosters to supply requisitions. To the Vorlax, this was bureaucratic backwater far beneath the concern of warriors, but to Kaito it was a potential treasure map, the Universal Compatibility Protocol, having already established its silent presence, navigated to this database with ease. Its security was robust, but it was designed to keep out spies and hackers looking for battle plans, not what it would consider low-level personnel data. The UCP, speaking the flawless language of an authorized internal system, was granted entry without a second glance. What Kaito found inside was a revelation that made his breath catch. Buried within the mountains of mundane data, reports on deuterium fuel consumption, inventories of spare parts was a single, heavily guarded file. Its title was innocuous, Fleet-Wide Cryptographic Maintenance Schedule. This was it. This was the crown jewels, Every secure military communication in the Federation relied on encryption keys, long, incredibly complex digital codes that scrambled messages, making them unreadable to anyone without the matching key. To maintain security, these keys were changed on a strict, predictable rotation. Knowing the schedule for these rotations was like knowing the exact times a bank vault's combination would be reset. For a brief moment after the change, while the new key was being distributed across the entire fleet, there was a period of vulnerability, a fleeting instant of confusion that a sufficiently prepared entity could exploit. Kaito's screen filled with a calendar of breathtaking significance. It detailed the exact dates and times down to the millisecond for the next 12 rotations of the command-level keys. He saw that the next change was scheduled for just 72 hours away during a routine fleet-wide systems update. The Vorlax, in their supreme confidence, had never considered that an enemy could get close enough to their logistical heart to ever see this information. Their security was a series of concentric, impenetrable walls, but they had left the blueprint for the gate mechanism lying on a table in the outermost courtyard, believing no one from the outside could ever reach it. In that quiet data center under the Alps, a human being now held the precise timetable for the moment the entire Vorlax fleet would briefly, unknowingly open its ears. The stone axe had just been used to quietly copy the master key to the fortress, and the guards inside were still laughing about the primitive tool they had dismissed days ago. 72 hours can feel like an eternity when you're waiting for a universe to blink. Inside the Alpine data center, the atmosphere was a unique blend of caffeine-fueled focus and unbearable tension. Kaito and his team monitored the Vorlax fleet's network with the patient stillness of predators, watching for any sign that their discovery had been detected. The fleet's activity was a study in routine arrogance. Supply shuttles came and went, daily drills continued, and the stream of encrypted command traffic flowed like a deep, unreadable river. Everything appeared normal, which was precisely what made Kaito the most nervous. Perfection in a system that large was unnatural. It was the quiet before a very specific, meticulously planned storm. That quiet was shattered not by a grand tactical move, but by a low-level bureaucrat's frustration. On the Vorlax station, a communications technician named Krell was nearing the end of a double shift. His primary duty was network hygiene, a tedious but critical task of purging non-essential data streams and unauthorized connections to keep the Federation's communications pristine. For weeks, his console had flagged a persistent, low-priority link to the human embassy server. It was listed in the system under its official mocking designation, Earth Diplomatic Artifact UCP. To Krell, it was an irritant, a piece of digital clutter from a species that had already been deemed irrelevant. With a major cryptographic rotation looming, standard procedure demanded a clean network slate. Seeing this primitive ping still active, this relic of a failed negotiation, felt like an insult to his professional pride. It was a smudge on the perfect crystal of Vorlax technology. So, with a grunt of annoyance, he selected the connection and initiated a standard-level purge command. It was a routine action, no different than deleting an old, unused file. He expected the link to simply vanish from his screen, a minor nuisance finally cleared away. What happened next was anything but routine. The moment his command was authenticated, the entire sector's communications board lit up with a screaming, crimson alert. A cascade of system warnings flooded Krell's display, each one more dire than the last. The alert wasn't coming from the human server. It was emanating from the very heart of the Star Reaver's command and control core. The warnings shouted of a critical memory overload, a cascading failure in the primary data buffer that handled real-time tactical information for the entire battle group. On his screen, a schematic of the Dreadnought's network showed a wave of red emanating from the core, threatening to crash the entire system. Panic seized Krell. A full core failure minutes before a key rotation would be a disaster, an event that would trigger an immediate high-priority investigation. an investigation that would inevitably trace the trigger back to his purge command. His career, his standing, everything would be obliterated. With a frantic, clawed hand, he slammed the abort sequence, reversing the purge command. Instantly, the crimson alerts vanished. The system stabilized, returning to its calm, blue normality as if nothing had ever happened. What Krell had encountered was not a flaw in his own technology, but the digital equivalent of a brilliantly designed booby trap. Kaito, anticipating that someone might try to sever the connection before their crucial window, had woven a defensive program directly into the UCP's handshake protocol. He called it a sympathetic failure routine. The UCP had spent weeks mapping the Star Reaver's internal architecture, learning its pressure points and alarm triggers. Kaito's program was designed to exploit that knowledge. When it detected a purge command, it didn't try to fight it. Instead, it sent a perfectly crafted, fleeting signal to the Dreadnought's own diagnostic systems. This signal mimicked the exact digital signature of the first nanosecond of a catastrophic core system crash. The Dreadnought's sophisticated AI, programmed to be hyper-vigilant against internal failures, immediately sounded the alarm. The entire event lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough to achieve its goal. To Krell, it was a terrifyingly close call, a near catastrophe caused by his own actions. He logged the incident as a network anomaly and a potential system instability, quietly vowing to never touch the human connection again. He had no idea that the instability was a phantom, a ghost in the machine created to protect the very link he sought to destroy. The stone axe, in its ultimate act of cunning, had convinced its wielder that trying to discard it would cause the whole fortress to crumble. The path was clear. The clock continued to tick down toward the rotation. The final countdown was a study in agonizing silence. In the data center, the only sounds were the hum of servers and the soft, rhythmic tapping of Kaito's fingers on his keyboard, a nervous tick as he watched the digital clock on his main display tick toward 0 hour. Across the void, aboard the Vorlax flagship, the process was unfolding with the cold, automated efficiency of a machine that had performed this task 1,000 times before. Deep within the Star Reaver's secure core, a quantum random number generator spun into action, creating a new, impossibly long encryption key, a string of digits so complex it would take a conventional computer millennia to crack. This new key was then packaged for distribution, and the fleet-wide systems update commenced. To the Vorlax, this was a routine chore, as mundane as changing the locks on a door they never expected anyone to approach. As the new key began its journey, pulsing through the network to every ship in the battle group, Kaito's creation stirred. The Universal Compatibility Protocol, which had maintained its silent, listening presence, detected the surge of high-priority traffic. It didn't attempt to block it or interfere. Instead, it performed an act of digital mimicry so perfect it was virtually undetectable. The UCP had long ago catalogued the unique digital signature of the Star Reaver's own internal data relays. As the encrypted packet containing the new key flew past, Kaito's program simply reached out and, for a fraction of a microsecond, impersonated one of those trusted relays. It sent a standard query to the packet, a routine confirm receipt signal that any part of the ship's own network would be expected to send. The security protocol, seeing a request from an authorized internal source, complied automatically, sending back a brief, unencrypted confirmation that contained a full copy of the key itself. It was the digital equivalent of a security guard handing a copy of the new combination to a colleague he recognizes, never realizing the colleague is an imposter wearing a perfect mask. The entire exchange was over in less time than it takes for a neuron to fire. The real key continued on its way, its integrity completely unaffected, completely unaware it had just been perfectly shadowed. On Kaito's screen, a new window bloomed to life. It was no longer a chaotic stream of raw code, but a clean, real-time transcript of the Vorlax fleet's command channel. The garbled, encrypted text resolved into crisp, clear Vorlax script which was instantly translated into English by the eye. The first message to appear was routine, a status report from a patrol frigate. The second was a logistics update, and then came the voice of Commander Zalk himself. His words, once boastful and condescending, now sounded in the quiet room with an eerie, unprotected clarity. Battle Group, assume formation Delta for the final sensor sweep of the Sol system. Let us ensure there are no surprises before we depart. Every syllable, every inflection of arrogant command was laid bare. For the first time since humanity had encountered the Galactic Federation, we were no longer listening from the outside. We were sitting in the room, hearing every word as if we were standing on the bridge beside them. The technological wall that had seemed so insurmountable had not been scaled or broken. It had simply become transparent. The stone axe had just been used to craft a key so perfect it didn't need to break the lock. It turned in silence, and the door swung open. The flawless choreography of the Vorlax war games shattered in an instant. On Kaito's main display, the orderly formation of blue icons representing Zalk's fleet dissolved into frantic, flashing red. Alarms that were not his own screamed through the translated command channel, a chaotic symphony of panic replacing the calm, arrogant tones of just moments before. The source of the disruption bloomed on the edge of the sensor sweep, a cluster of new, aggressively angular signatures that the UCP automatically tagged with a Federation-wide threat designation, Cathar. A renegade species known for their predatory, hit-and-run tactics and a bitter, generations-long feud with the Vorlax Dominion. They had jumped into the Sol system with no warning, a wolf pack appearing at the garden gate. Commander Zalk's voice, now stripped of all its condescending grandeur, barked across the fleet-wide channel, sharp with a tension that bordered on panic. All units abort exercise, abort battle stations, form defensive sphere around the Star Reaver. Now. The Vorlax fleet, which moments before had been a display of overwhelming power for a primitive audience, now scrambled like startled insects. Dreadnoughts that had been gracefully arcing through space fired emergency thrusters, lurching into tight, protective positions. Swarms of attack craft abandoned their intricate formations, coalescing into a dense defensive cloud. The spectacle of invincibility had vanished, replaced by the raw, unscripted reality of a military force caught off guard. On Kaito's screen, the entire tactical situation was laid bare in real time. He could see the Cathar battle group, smaller but faster and more numerous, already beginning to flank, their vectors painting a picture of a classic pincer maneuver. He could hear the strained reports from Zalk's squadron commanders, their voices tight as they confirmed new enemy contacts and reported minor shield impacts from long-range probing fire. The Vorlax, for all their technological superiority, were reacting, not acting. They were on the defensive, and their every move was being broadcast directly into a small, quiet room on Earth. The theoretical had just become terrifyingly practical, and the fate of two alien fleets, along with the helpless planet caught between them, was now unfolding in plain text on a human computer screen. Commander Zalk's frantic orders to form a defensive sphere created a surge of digital traffic, a torrent of coordinates and vectors flooding the command net. To the Vorlax, this was a lifeline, the disciplined response of a trained fleet. To Kaito, it was an open canvas. With the fleet-wide encryption keys now in his possession, this torrent of data wasn't just readable, it was malleable. Every ship was reporting its position and receiving its new orders in the clear, and the system trusted every single transmission implicitly. Kaito's team didn't need to shout or force their way in. They simply began to whisper, their voices perfectly mimicking the trusted tones of the fleet's own command hierarchy. The takeover was not an act of brute force, but one of delicate, surgical precision. The UCP's artificial intelligence, having studied countless hours of the fleet's exercises, understood the standard defensive protocols inside and out. It knew the exact formation Zalk was trying to achieve. As the orders zipped from the Star Reaver to the frigates and destroyers on the fleet's starboard flank, Kaito's program intercepted them. It didn't delete the original commands or issue contradictory ones. That would have been instantly detected. Instead, it performed a subtle, almost artistic act of corruption. It altered the numerical values of the destination coordinates by a few hundred kilometers, a distance that was virtually insignificant on the scale of solar system combat, but tactically catastrophic for a tight defensive formation. The Star Reaver's central computer displayed the new formation taking shape, the icons of its ships dutifully moving to their assigned positions. From Zalk's perspective on the bridge, everything appeared normal. The system showed a perfect, unbroken sphere of protective firepower, but the reality unfolding in space was dangerously different. The starboard flank, which should have been a solid wall of overlapping shield projectors and weapon arcs, was instead a porous, fragmented line. Two destroyers, whose courses were subtly tweaked, now found themselves slightly too far apart, creating a gap just wide enough for a Cathar attack wing to slip through. A cruiser, its assigned vector minutely adjusted, was now lagging behind, leaving a vulnerable blind spot in the formation's anti-fighter coverage. The alterations were so slight that the individual ship captains noticed nothing amiss. Their own navigational systems confirmed they were heading exactly where command had told them to go. The system was lying to everyone, and everyone trusted the system completely. Meanwhile, the Cathar raiders, predators honed by centuries of guerrilla warfare, saw the weakness immediately. Their sensors, probing the Vorlax lines, detected the anomalous gaps. What they perceived was not a cunning trap, but sheer Vorlax incompetence under pressure, a failure of command and control that presented a golden opportunity. With a series of guttural clicks over their own battle channel, the Cathar pack leader diverted his fastest ships toward the suddenly apparent soft spots in the Vorlax defense. They accelerated, a swarm of jagged, dark-hulled vessels slicing through the void directly toward the gaps that Kaito had so carefully engineered. The Vorlax were preparing for a head-on assault, but the real attack was about to come from the seams of their own, digitally sabotaged formation. The masters of plasma steel were relying on a perfect, interconnected web of technology to save them, never suspecting that a species they had dismissed for its simplicity had just learned to pluck the most vital strands, making the web itself betray its creators. The Cathar vanguard opened fire, and the void between Jupiter and its moons became a storm of energy. Green particle beams lanced out from the angular alien ships, spearing through the space where the Vorlax defensive sphere should have been an impenetrable wall. But the wall was full of holes. On the bridge of the Star Reaver, Commander Zalk stared at his tactical display in utter disbelief. The formation he saw on his screen was a masterpiece of defensive positioning, but the frantic damage reports flooding in from his starboard flank told a completely different, horrifying story. The first sign of the catastrophic disconnect came from the heavy cruisers Blood Drinker and Sky Rend. Receiving their movement orders from the flagship's battle computer, both ships fired their main thrusters to assume their positions in the defensive sphere. But the coordinates they received, subtly altered by Kaito's Ghost Hand program, were not complementary. Instead of sliding into a harmonious, overlapping orbit, the two massive warships found themselves on an intercept course. Proximity alarms shrieked inside both vessels as their navigational computers, each faithfully following the corrupted data, tried to correct at the last second. The Blood Drinker's port side maneuvering thrusters flared violently, while the Sky Wren pitched downward. They missed a full collision by less than a kilometer, a hair's breadth in celestial terms, but the violent evasion maneuvers sent them careening out of formation, their shield projectors flickering as they struggled to stabilize. The gap they were supposed to be protecting now yawned wide open, a perfect invitation for the enemy. It was an invitation the Cathar eagerly accepted. A wing of their swift, dagger-like attack craft, seeing the chaotic stumble of the two cruisers, swerved through the newly created breach. Their target was the Vorlax destroyer Swift Judgment, which was itself attempting to comply with its own set of subtly sabotaged orders. The destroyer's captain had been commanded to hold a specific point to cover the cruiser's flank, but the hacked coordinates placed his ship not in a position of strength, but directly in the path of the incoming Cathar strike force. As the Swift Judgment's engines pulsed to maintain its assigned station, its crew watched in horror as the enemy ships filled their forward viewports. The destroyer's own systems, receiving data from the compromised fleet network, initially registered the Cathar as distant contacts, their true vectors misrepresented by the corrupted data stream. By the time the Swift Judgment's short-range sensors overrode the faulty network data and screamed a warning, it was far too late. A concentrated volley of Cathar plasma torpedoes slammed into the destroyer's exposed side. Its shields, already strained and partially angled away from the unexpected angle of attack, collapsed instantly. The hit tore a gash in the ship's hull, venting atmosphere and debris into the cold vacuum. The Swift Judgment listed, a wounded beast bleeding fire and air into the battle space. From his vantage point on the Star Reaver, Zalk could only watch the calamity unfold. His command screen showed one reality, a fleet responding perfectly while the audio channel blared with the panicked, contradictory reports of his commanders. He heard the captain of the sky rend shouting about a near miss with a friendly vessel. He heard the dying transmission from the Swift Judgment cut short by the explosion. His own officers on the bridge were staring at their consoles, their confidence shattered by the impossible dissonance between the clean data on their screens and the chaotic destruction happening right outside their viewports. Zalk's rage curdled into a cold, sickening realization. This was not the result of enemy brilliance or even simple misfortune. This was a systemic failure on a level he could not comprehend. His technology, the very foundation of his power, was lying to him. The perfect, interconnected web of his command and control system had become a hall of mirrors, reflecting back a flawless image of a battle that was, in reality, a complete and utter shambles. The masters of plasma steel were losing control not because their weapons were inferior, but because the invisible threads that bound their fleet together had been silently, expertly severed by a hand they still refused to believe existed. The panic in Commander Zalk's voice was no longer the bluster of an angry warrior. It was the raw, exposed terror of a man watching his entire reality unravel. "What is happening? Report system malfunctions," he screamed, his demand echoing across a command channel he still believed was secure. The response from his chief engineer was even more damning than silence. "All systems read nominal, Commander." The engineer's voice crackled back, laced with a confusion that bordered on despair. The diagnostics show green across the board. "But the ships are not responding to helm control correctly. The data does not match what we are seeing." This confession of helplessness, broadcast in the clear to human listeners, was the ultimate vindication of the ghost hand strategy. Zalk and his crew were trapped in a perfect prison of their own design. Their screens showed a universe of order, a meticulously rendered simulation where every ship obeyed its programmed instructions. But through the actual viewports of the Star Reaver and on the short-range scanners of every vessel in the formation, they could see the horrifying truth. Their fleet was behaving like a phantom limb, moving in ways that defied both logic and command. A frigate assigned to provide close support for a damaged cruiser would instead veer away on a seemingly random course correction. A wing of fighters ordered to form a defensive screen would find themselves vectoring directly into the path of friendly fire. Each captain was following the orders displayed on their own console, each one certain they were the only point of sanity in a suddenly mad fleet. The result was a cascading wave of disorganization and friendly fire incidents that turned the Vorlax defensive sphere into a chaotic, self-destructive whirlpool. This was the core of the human advantage, laid bare in the most brutal way possible. The Federation's technology was built on a foundation of absolute trust. A command from the flagship was treated as gospel because the system that delivered it was considered infallible. There were no checks for paradoxes, no protocols for what to do when the central network itself became an agent of deception. Why would there be? The concept was as alien to them as their own plasma steel would have been to a medieval blacksmith. Humanity, by contrast, had built its entire digital world on a foundation of healthy paranoia. Our history with computers is a long story of viruses, hackers, bugs, and system failures. We expect our technology to lie to us. We build in redundancies, firewalls, and manual overrides precisely because we know that no system is ever truly perfect or completely secure. The Vorlax had reached a technological plateau where they believed they had solved the equation, creating a perfect, seamless whole. Humans had never stopped living in the messy, unpredictable real world, and that hard-earned skepticism had just become our most powerful weapon. In the Alpine data center, the atmosphere was one of grim focus, not celebration. Kaito monitored the chaos, his team making minute adjustments to the corrupting data stream. They weren't guiding the battle, they were simply deepening the cracks, ensuring that the Vorlax fleet's attempts to self-correct only led to further confusion. When Zalk, in a desperate move, ordered all ships to switch to a secondary emergency command frequency, the UCP was already waiting. It had mapped those backup channels weeks ago. The moment the switch was commanded, Kaito's program seamlessly transferred its corrupting influence to the new network, presenting the same flawless, deceptive data. To the Vorlax engineers, it was a nightmare from which they could not wake. Each attempted fix, each fallback protocol, only seemed to make the situation worse, reinforcing the terrifying illusion that their entire technological paradigm was suffering a spontaneous, catastrophic collapse. They were frantically trying to reboot a computer, unaware that the very keyboard they were using was programmed to sabotage every command they typed. The stone axe had not just broken the lock, it had convinced the locksmith that the entire concept of locks was a lie. The final, decisive act was not one of violence but of ultimate assertion. Kaito watched the tactical display, a masterpiece of digital chaos he had orchestrated. The Vorlax fleet was a tangled, thrashing beast crippled by its own misguided instincts. Commander Zalk's voice was a constant, desperate crackle over the command channel, his orders becoming increasingly frantic and contradictory as he tried to wrestle control from a phantom. But every command he issued only served to tighten the invisible net. The time for subtle manipulation was over. Now was the moment for a clean, surgical severance. With a few deliberate keystrokes, Kaito initiated the final protocol, a program he had code-named King's Gambit. Aboard the Star Reaver, Commander Zalk was in the throes of a full-blown command meltdown. He slammed his fists on his console, screaming coordinates that his officers relayed with trembling hands. But then, the unthinkable happened. The main tactical screen, the very heart of his command, flickered once and then went completely dark. Not to standby, not to an error message, but to a flat, featureless black. A collective gasp swept the bridge. Zalk stabbed at the controls, but they were utterly unresponsive. His personal command console, a terminal that granted him dominion over an entire battle group, had been transformed into a worthless slab of metal and glass. He was no longer a commander, he was a passenger, locked in a soundproof room at the center of a battle he could no longer influence. The silence that fell on the bridge was more terrifying than any alarm. It was the silence of absolute impotence. In that profound silence, a new voice cut across the fleet-wide channel. It was not the guttural bark of a Vorlax officer, nor the hostile clicks of the Cathar. It was calm, measured, and spoke in the distinct, accented tones of galactic common that every being on the channel recognized instantly. It was the voice of Ambassador Thorne. "This is Ambassador Thorne of Earth," he said, his words carrying an authority that was both gentle and absolute. the Vorlax fleet will stand down its weapons and power down its engines. This conflict is over. The effect was instantaneous and surreal. On every Vorlax bridge, from the crippled Swift Judgment to the mighty but helpless Star Reaver, officers stared at their comms units in stunned disbelief. This was impossible. It was a violation of the natural order so profound it short-circuited their understanding. The human, the representative of the Stone Axe civilization, was giving them orders on their own secure military channel. For a long moment, there was only stunned silence, broken by the faint pops of distant weapons fire. Then, the Cathar raiders, sensing a shift they couldn't comprehend but were eager to exploit, pressed their attack, their weapons flaring toward the disorganized Vorlax lines. Thorne's voice returned, its tone shifting from command to chillingly specific instruction. Vorlax vessel sky rend, your starboard shield emitters are overloading. Divert power from secondary life support to stabilize them. Blood Drinker, a Cathar strike group, is vectoring on your ventral thrusters. Deploy your point defense screen now. He was not just commanding a ceasefire, he was directing their battle, diagnosing their vulnerabilities with an intimacy that was both miraculous and terrifying. He was seeing everything. He knew the status of their ships better than they did. The final, horrifying truth dawned on every Vorlax officer listening. The human ambassador wasn't just on their channel, he was in their systems. He was the ghost that had been haunting them, and he had just revealed himself not as a poltergeist but as a god. One by one, across the fractured Vorlax formation, the violent blooms of their plasma cannons sputtered and died. Thorne's calm, impossible voice had accomplished what Zalk's rage could not. It had imposed a new, undeniable reality. The captains of the ships that were still functional made a calculation that transcended their training. Continuing to fight meant not just facing the Cathar, but battling an enemy that had rendered their own technology a weapon against them. To disobey the voice was to invite annihilation from an unseen, all-knowing adversary. A single weapons officer on a destroyer far from the Star Reaver was the first to comply, initiating the power-down sequence for his ship's main battery. It was an act of surrender, but also one of survival. Like a chain reaction, the order was silently obeyed across the fleet. The great engines of the Vorlax dreadnoughts, which had crossed light years to demonstrate their power, began to wind down, their deep hum fading into an eerie quiet. The masters of plasma steel had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a superior understanding, their own invincible fleet silenced by the calm, clear voice of the species they had laughed into obscurity. A profound, almost sacred silence descended upon the Vorlax fleet, a stillness so complete it seemed to swallow the very sound of the distant Cathar engines. Ambassador Thorne's words hung in the void, their impossible clarity echoing in the minds of every warrior on every bridge. For a few heartbeats, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the silence was shattered by a raw, guttural roar from the bridge of the Star Reaver. Commander Zalk, his scales flushed a dark, mottled purple with rage and humiliation, erupted from his command chair. Override it, find the source of that transmission and purge it from the network. Now, he bellowed, his claws scraping against the dark glass of his dead console. His officers scrambled, their own screens a chaotic mix of functional secondary systems and the same pervasive blackout that had claimed the primary command array. They typed frantically, initiating every emergency protocol, every cyber warfare countermeasure in their extensive manuals, but each command was like shouting into a void. The system accepted their inputs but gave nothing back. It was a perfect mocking silence. Zalk leaned over the shoulder of his chief communications officer, his breath hot and heavy. There must be a way to re-establish direct command. Bypass the main computer, use the hardline relays. The officer, a younger Vorlax whose composure was fraying into sheer terror, shook his head. The hardlines are reporting a physical disconnect, Commander. The system logs indicate the couplings were remotely disengaged. The statement was so absurd it barely registered. Remotely disengaging physical couplings inside a sealed warship was like a ghost untying your shoes. It was an act of violation on a level they had no framework to understand. Zalk's fury peaked, a blinding need to lash out at something, anything. He raised a fist to bring it down on the unresponsive console, a final, futile act of physical defiance against an intangible enemy. In that exact moment, as his arm tensed, his personal command screened the one terminal that had been utterly dark flickered to life, but it did not restore his control. Instead, it displayed nothing but a field of stark white, upon which 2 lines of text appeared, written in the simple, blocky font of Human Basic. There was no fanfare, no complex graphic. Just words. Zalk froze, his fist hovering in the air, his eyes narrowing as he read the message that had traveled across space to meet him in his moment of ultimate powerlessness. It translated directly in his mind, the meaning as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. They laughed at the stone axe. Now it holds your fleet. The effect on the Vorlax commander was more devastating than any plasma torpedo blast. The roar died in his throat. The purple flush of rage drained from his scales, leaving behind a pale, ashen gray. His arm slowly lowered to his side. He understood. This wasn't a random system failure or a sophisticated K-Thar hacking tool. This was the direct, personal consequence of his own arrogance in the Grand Assembly. The primitive artifact, the gift he had mocked as a stone axe, had not just defeated him, it had rendered him a spectator in his own defeat. The message was a signature. It was the architect of his humiliation identifying himself, not with a boast, but with a simple statement of fact that echoed the very insult Zalk had once thrown at humanity. The stone axe was indeed a humble tool, but in the hands of a species that understood its true purpose, it had become the only tool that mattered. It was no longer about retaking control. That possibility had vanished. It was about the undeniable truth that he, Commander Zalk of the Vorlax Dominion, was a prisoner inside his own flagship, and the key to his cell was a technology he had been too proud to even see as a threat. The fight went out of him, replaced by a chilling, hollow realization of his own obsolescence. From the bridge of his jagged command ship, the Cathar pack leader Grax watched the unfolding spectacle with a sense of profound, unnerving disbelief. His multifaceted eyes, evolved to track the swiftest prey across the ash plains of his homeworld, could not process what they were seeing. Moments ago, the Vorlax battle group had been a coiled spring of lethal energy, a formidable opponent he had engaged in a dozen bloody skirmishes across the sector. Now it was a dying, not in the explosive, glorious fashion of battle, but with a quiet, systemic strangulation that was far more terrifying. The brilliant flares of their plasma cannons winked out one by one. The powerful engines that lit up his sensors like miniature stars began to dim, their energetic hum fading from his audio pickups. The Vorlax ships weren't retreating, they were simply stopping. It was as if a god had simply reached out and pressed a giant, invisible pause button on reality itself. Grax's own bridge, usually a cacophony of guttural commands and the sharp clicks of tactical updates, fell into a hushed silence. His warriors looked from their screens to him, their predatory confidence replaced by a deep-seated confusion. This was not a known Vorlax tactic. It was surrender, but it felt nothing like surrender. It felt like an extinction. Before Grax could formulate a new order, his communications officer let out a sharp, startled hiss. Pack leader, an incoming transmission. The point of origin is the third planet, the human world. The officer's voice was laced with a superstitious dread that was rare among the battle-hardened Cathar. A human transmission in the middle of a battle between two star-faring powers. It made no tactical sense. Grax snarled, a reflexive gesture of dominance, and gestured for the channel to be opened. The voice that filled his bridge was calm, measured, and spoke in the same galactic common used by the Federation, but its tone was utterly alien. It held no fear, no bluster, no desperation. It was the voice of someone stating a simple, unavoidable fact. Pack leader Grax, the voice said, identifying him by name with an ease that was itself a declaration of power. This is Ambassador Thorne of Earth. The Vorlax threat in this system has been neutralized. We request you stand down your attack. There is no longer a need for conflict here. Grax was a creature of instinct and swift, brutal action. He was not prone to philosophical contemplation, but in that moment he was forced to confront a reality that shattered his understanding of the cosmos. The humans were not a spacefaring power. They were infants barely able to leave their own atmosphere. By every law of nature and war, they should have been cowering on their world, praying that the giants fighting in their sky would simply go away. Instead, they were dictating terms. They had not just asked for a ceasefire, they had announced that the fight was over, and they had done so with the quiet authority of a victor surveying a concluded battle. The Vorlax fleet, a force that could have glassed his entire flotilla, had been rendered inert not by him, but by these primitives. His first instinct was to press the attack, to tear into the helpless Vorlax ships and claim a definitive victory. But a colder, more calculating thought quickly followed. What power had the humans used to accomplish this? It was not a weapon he could see or understand. It was a form of control so absolute it bordered on magic. If they could do this to the Vorlax, what was to stop them from doing it to his own ships? The human ambassador had not issued a threat. He had simply presented a new reality. To continue fighting was to ignore that reality, to charge blindly into a fog where the very systems his ships relied upon could be turned against them at any moment. Grax looked back at his tactical display, at the silent, darkening icons of the Vorlax fleet. They weren't just defeated, they were humiliated, and the architect of that humiliation was now speaking to him with a calmness that was more intimidating than any roar. With a slow, deliberate gesture that felt like it carried the weight of his entire species' future, Grax signaled to his communications officer. Acknowledge the human, he growled, the words tasting like ash. All ships power down weapons and hold position. The order was given not out of respect or diplomacy, but out of a primal, survivalist caution. He had come to fight the Vorlax, but he had stumbled upon a far greater and far more mysterious power. The silence that followed Ambassador Thorne's declaration was heavier than the void outside their ships. It was a silence filled not with absence, but with the deafening weight of a universe realigning itself. The Cathar raiders held their positions, their weapons cold, their predatory instincts overruled by a deeper, more primal caution. The Vorlax fleet floated like a constellation of tombs, their crews paralyzed by the revelation that their own command chairs had become cages. Into this profound stillness, Thorne's voice returned, its tone shifting from the finality of a victor to the measured clarity of a teacher explaining a fundamental, overlooked truth. Earth's technology is not about brute force, he began, the words carrying across the light years with a quiet power that demanded contemplation. It is about connection. This simple statement was perhaps the most revolutionary idea ever introduced to the galactic stage. For eons, the path of progress for every spacefaring species had been a linear climb toward greater power, stronger shields, and faster engines. It was an arms race of magnitude, a philosophy where advancement was measured in the capacity to destroy. The Federation, and even renegades like the Cathar, existed within this paradigm. Their technology was a series of ever taller walls and sharper spears. Humanity, by contrast, had taken a different path entirely. We looked at the walls and did not seek to build taller ones. We sought to understand the mortar that held them together. We looked at the spears and focused not on sharpening the tip, but on the hand that wielded it. And today, Thorne continued, we connected you to a new reality. This was not a boast. It was a simple, factual report on the state of the cosmos. The connection he spoke of was not the crude, physical linking of cables and transceivers that the Federation understood. It was a deeper, more intimate form of connection, the connection of understanding. The Universal Compatibility Protocol was the ultimate expression of this principle. It did not attempt to overpower a Vorlax security system. It listened to it, learned its language, and learned to speak with its own voice. It connected not by breaking through, but by being invited in. In doing so, it demonstrated that true power lies not in isolation and superiority, but in the ability to interface, to integrate, and to comprehend. The Vorlax fleet was not defeated by a superior weapon. It was neutralized by a superior conversation. Their own networked reality, the very thing that gave them their coordinated strength, had been seamlessly woven into a larger, human-controlled network, a web they never even knew was being spun around them. One where humanity is not to be underestimated. This final phrase landed with the force of a cosmic law being inscribed into the fabric of history. It was a warning, but it was also an invitation. The message was clear: you may have the plasma steel, but we hold the blueprint for the forge. You may have the dreadnoughts, but we understand the language of their computers. From this day forward, any interaction with humanity would have to begin with this acknowledgement. Underestimating us was not just a tactical error, it was a fundamental failure to grasp the nature of our ingenuity. Our strength was never in matching the scale of their achievements, but in our unique perspective, a perspective forged in a crucible of adversity, where scarcity bred creativity and diversity bred resilience. Where they saw a stone axe, we saw a universal tool capable of building, of healing, and when necessary, of demonstrating with impeccable logic why it should never be dismissed. The laughter in the Grand Assembly had not been silenced by a louder shout, but by the quiet, inexorable proof that the joke had in fact been on them all along. The channel crackled to life, but the voice that emerged was a ghost of its former self. Gone was the guttural roar of Commander Zalk, replaced by a low, strained rasp that seemed to carry the weight of a shattered empire. Ambassador Thorne, the voice began, each syllable a struggle against a pride that had been systematically dismantled. The Vorlax Dominion acknowledges the current tactical reality. There was a long pause, filled only by the hum of the ship's failing systems. When he spoke again, it was with the raw confusion of a child who has just watched the sun rise in the west. But I must know how our systems are the pinnacle of 10,000 years of evolution. They were impenetrable. The question hung in the void, a plea from a warrior who had built his entire identity on a foundation that had just been revealed to be sand. Thorne's response, when it came, was not delivered with triumph or condescension. It held the calm, patient tone of a master craftsman explaining a fundamental principle to a novice who had overlooked the most basic step. Impenetrable from the outside, Commander Thorne clarified gently, "Your mistake was believing the only direction of threat was forward from a peer adversary with a bigger hammer. You never considered the door you yourselves opened." He let the implication settle in the silence that followed. "You integrated our protocol. When your fleet scanned the Universal Compatibility Protocol, you didn't just analyze a piece of foreign technology. You initiated a full, two-way dialogue. You invited us in." This simple statement contained the devastating core of humanity's strategy. The Federation's technological paradigm was built on a fortress mentality. Their security was a series of ever higher walls designed to withstand a direct siege. But humanity had never planned to scale those walls. We simply watched as the gatekeepers, in their arrogant curiosity, opened a small, overlooked side door to get a better look at the primitive artifact outside. And in that moment, we didn't charge through. We simply learned the language of the guards, studied the architecture of the hallways, and memorized the layout of the entire fortress. The UCP was never a key, it was a language tutor, and the Vorlax had enthusiastically enrolled in its first lesson. Their own networked nature, the very source of their coordinated strength, became their ultimate vulnerability. A fortress can withstand a bombardment, but it cannot defend against an idea that has already been welcomed inside its walls and offered a seat at the command table. The stone axe had been examined, deemed harmless, and then brought into the armory where it proceeded to demonstrate a quiet, profound understanding of every weapon on the rack. Across the Federation, the victory was not measured in salvos fired or ships destroyed, but in the silent, seismic shift of perception. The video of the Vorlax debacle, captured by long-range Cathar sensors and leaked by disgruntled junior officers, did not just circulate, it detonated. It was not the grand, explosive finale of a standard space battle, but something far more unnerving. Viewers on 1,000 worlds saw the sleek, terrifying forms of Vorlax dreadnoughts not exploding but simply stopping. They watched as the coordinated dance of a battle group dissolved into a chaotic, helpless stumble, all to the soundtrack of Commander Zalk's escalating, impotent rage and the chillingly calm interjections of a human voice. This was not a display of power as the galaxy understood it. This was something new, something incomprehensible. It was the spectacle of a predator being declawed not by a larger beast, but by an unseen hand that had gently taken control of its nervous system. The emergency session of the Grand Assembly was a scene of barely controlled pandemonium. The same delegates who had weeks earlier filled the vast chamber with mocking clicks and hisses now communicated in hushed, urgent tones. The condescending amusement was gone, replaced by a palpable, cold fear. The Vorlax delegation, once preeminent, sat in shamed silence, their representative offering no defense, only a tersely worded statement confirming their fleet's temporary systems anomaly and subsequent withdrawal. But the truth was in the recording, and everyone had seen it. The myth of alien technological invincibility, a cornerstone of the Federation's political order for millennia, lay in shattered fragments. If the mighty Vorlax, with their 10,000-year head start, could be rendered so utterly helpless by a species that had barely mastered radio a few centuries ago, then what did that mean for everyone else? The unspoken question hung thick in the air. If humanity could do this to the Vorlax, what could they do to us? This forced a brutal, universal reconsideration. Diplomatic corridors that had been cold and closed to humanity were suddenly buzzing with activity. Overtures that would have been unthinkable before were now being drafted with frantic haste. The calculus of power had been fundamentally altered. It was no longer about how much firepower a species could project, but about the resilience and flexibility of their entire technological paradigm. Military analysts who had previously studied fleet compositions and weapon yields were now forced to become philosophers, grappling with the human concept of compatibility. They pored over the few public records of Earth's history, searching for clues. They studied our age of fragmented, competing computer systems, our endless format wars, our global network that was both miraculously interconnected and perpetually vulnerable to viruses and hackers. Where they saw chaos and weakness, we had forged our greatest strength, an inherent understanding that no system is an island, and that the ability to make different systems communicate is a form of power more subtle and more profound than any plasma cannon. Overnight, humanity was transformed from a galactic punchline into the galaxy's most enigmatic and dangerous wild card. The narrative was no longer about primitive apes offering stone axes. It was about a species whose ingenuity operated on a wavelength no one else had thought to tune into. We were no longer dismissed as harmless, we were feared as unpredictable. The very simplicity of our approach was its greatest asset because it existed outside the complex, predictable framework of galactic advancement. Other species began to look at their own hyper-advanced, deeply integrated technologies not with pride, but with a new and terrifying suspicion. How many silent backdoors did their own systems contain? How much of their sovereignty was an illusion, dependent on a network that a sufficiently clever outsider might learn to speak? The laughter had not just stopped, it had been replaced by the quiet, anxious sound of 1,000 civilizations nervously checking the locks on their own digital doors, wondering if the humble, adaptable key humanity had offered was still on the table and what it might truly cost to accept it. Back on Earth, the news of the Vorlax stand-down arrived not with public celebration, but with a profound, almost unnerving stillness in the secure command bunkers buried deep beneath Geneva. The screens that had for weeks displayed the terrifying ballet of alien warships now showed only a static field of stars, the Vorlax fleet holding its silent, powered-down position. It was in this atmosphere of cautious disbelief that Kaito, his face pale from countless hours staring at code but his eyes burning with a quiet fire, faced the assembled planetary leadership. These were not Starfleet admirals, they were diplomats, scientists, and politicians, the very people who had authorized his desperate gamble, and now he had to explain what he had actually done. He began not with a declaration of victory, but with a fundamental correction of their expectations. "We did not destroy their fleet," Kaito stated, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tense silence. To have done so would have been to adopt their philosophy, to meet their overwhelming force with a greater, more brutal force of our own. It would have proven nothing except that we could become what we feared. He let that idea settle in the room. The goal was never annihilation. Annihilation invites revenge, creates martyrs, and starts a cycle of violence that a fledgling interstellar species like humanity could never hope to win. Instead, Kaito described the operation as something far more refined, something uniquely human. He called it a surgical strike, but not on the ships themselves. The target was something far more abstract and far more vital, their sense of control. Using a series of intricate data visualizations, he walked the leaders through the ghost hand operation. He showed them how the UCP had created a perfect digital map of the Vorlax command structure, a mirror image of their own networked consciousness. "We didn't attack their hulls or their engines," he explained, pointing to a schematic of the Star Reaver where certain data pathways glowed with a soft, invasive light. "We introduced a controlled, localized dissonance between their intention and their execution. We created a scenario where every command they issued was perfectly received, but subtly misinterpreted by their own systems." He used a simple, powerful analogy to make the concept clear. Imagine a master pianist, Kaito suggested, a virtuoso who has played the same grand piano for decades, believing they know every nuance of its sound. Now imagine if we could ever so slightly detune one key, just a fraction of a note on that piano. The pianist strikes the key with the same confidence, the same force as always, but the note that comes out is subtly wrong. They would blame their own finger, their own ear, the humidity in the room, anything but the piano itself, because their faith in the instrument is absolute. That is what we did to Commander Zalk. We detuned his piano, and in his frantic attempts to play a perfect symphony of war, he created only cacophony. The ultimate demonstration of this control, Kaito emphasized, was the complete absence of lethal force. The Vorlax ships were not scarred by battle, they were pristine. Their crews were not casualties, they were bewildered passengers. "We achieved total domination without firing a single shot from our side," he said, a note of quiet pride entering his voice. "The only damage sustained was from their own friendly fire, a direct result of the confusion we orchestrated. We took the most powerful battle group in the local galaxy and turned it into a floating museum exhibit of its own impotence. We didn't break their spear, we simply showed them that the hand holding it was no longer their own. This, he concluded, was the core of the new paradigm. Humanity's strength lay in precision, not power, in understanding, not overpowering. The victory was not just in neutralizing a threat, but in delivering a lesson so profound it would resonate across the stars. We had demonstrated that the most advanced civilization could be humbled not by a bigger weapon, but by a better idea. The Vorlax had come to teach us a lesson about our place in the universe, and in the end, we had been the ones to give the masterclass a lesson in the quiet, devastating power of systemic control. The shift in the galactic balance of power was not signaled by a public ceremony or a formal treaty, but by a single, heavily encrypted data packet that arrived at the human embassy with a priority code so high it bypassed all normal diplomatic channels. It bore the digital seal of the Vorlax Dominion's innermost Security Council, a mark reserved for matters of species-level existential threat. The message contained no demands, no threats, no bluster. Instead, it was a request for a clandestine meeting, an act of submission so profound it was, in its own way, more shocking than the fleet's surrender. The masters of plasma steel were not coming for revenge. They were coming as supplicants, forced to acknowledge a terrifying void in their own understanding. The meeting took place not in the grand halls of the Federation station, but in a sterile, neutral conference room aboard a small, unmarked transport vessel in deep space. On one side sat Ambassador Thorne and a calm, focused Kaito. On the other, the Vorlax delegation was a study in shattered pride. The lead representative was not a military commander, but a senior technologist named Vorlan, his scales dull and his posture devoid of the characteristic Vorlax rigidity. He was flanked by two aides who seemed to be trying to shrink into the bulkheads. Vorlan dispensed with any formal greeting, his voice a low, gravelly hum devoid of its species' usual aggression. "We are here," he began, "because our models have no frame of reference for what you have done. We have simulated every known form of cyber warfare, every conceivable exploit. Your method does not register as an attack. Our artificial intelligences classify it as a systemic, spontaneous failure. This is unacceptable." What followed was not a negotiation, but a desperate, humiliating interrogation. The Vorlax had spent centuries, perhaps millennia, building their technology on a foundation of perfect, predictable logic. Their security was a series of ever higher walls designed to withstand a direct assault from a peer adversary. They understood kinetic impacts, energy shielding, and electronic countermeasures, but the concept of a weapon that didn't break the wall, but instead convinced the wall itself to serve a new master, was a form of warfare that lay entirely outside their paradigm. Vorlan's questions were those of an engineer who has just watched a fundamental law of physics be rewritten. How did your protocol bypass our quantum encryption without a brute force attack? Our keys are mathematically unbreakable. Kaito's answer was simple and to the Vorlax utterly illogical. We didn't break the encryption. Your own systems gave us the key during a routine handshake. You trusted the handshake protocol implicitly. We did not. This exchange revealed the core of the chasm between the two species' technological philosophies. The Vorlax had reached a point where they trusted their own creations absolutely. Their networks were seamless, homogeneous, and built on a universal standard they considered flawless. To them, a request from within the network was by definition legitimate. Humanity, by contrast, had evolved in a digital ecosystem that was a chaotic, beautiful mess. We had competing operating systems, incompatible software, and a global internet that was both a miracle of connection and a playground for viruses, scammers, and hackers. We had learned through bitter experience that no system is ever truly secure, that trust must be verified, and that the most dangerous threat often comes wearing the mask of a friend. Our strength was not in building perfect systems, but in understanding the inherent imperfections in all systems. Vorlan listened, his alien face a mask of dawning horror as Kaito explained concepts like zero-trust architecture, assumed breach, and social engineering. To the Vorlax, these were not advanced security concepts, they were a form of pathological paranoia. The idea of building a network where no component, internal or external, is inherently trusted was anathema to their culture of centralized, absolute control. Yet, the evidence of its effectiveness floated impotently near Jupiter. The Vorlax High Command, facing the prospect that their entire civilization was built on a foundation of digital sand, had no choice. The back-channel communication became a permanent, secret conduit. In a stunning reversal of roles, Earth cybersecurity experts, once dismissed as primitive tinkerers, found themselves acting as consultants to the most advanced warrior race in the galaxy. Human engineers began receiving encrypted schematics of Vorlax systems not to exploit them, but to perform penetration testing and offer recommendations on how to patch the very vulnerabilities humanity had so brilliantly exposed. The Stone Axe had not just won a battle, it had been hired as the chief inspector for the fortress, its humble appearance belying a unique expertise that the masters of the fortress now realized they desperately lacked. The Great Chamber was the same, the mist-shrouded ceiling and the 1,000 alien delegates unchanged, but the air was different. The palpable condescension that had once hung like a fog had been replaced by a brittle, watchful silence. Every eye, from the multifaceted orbs of the insectoid xylos to the lidless gazes of the serpentine grille, was fixed on the single human figure standing in the center of the vast floor. Ambassador Thorne did not hold a data slate this time. His hands were empty, a subtle but powerful statement. He did not need to offer a gift anymore. He was there to deliver a verdict. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of recent events to settle fully upon the assembled powers. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with a clarity that seemed to still the very air in the room. You once measured strength by the size of your guns and the thickness of your armor. He began, his gaze sweeping slowly across the tiers of silent delegates. You saw our technology as primitive and you laughed. You are not wrong to see a difference, but you are tragically mistaken in its meaning. He paused, ensuring every translator relayed his words with perfect fidelity. The Vorlax fleet remains intact. Its crews are unharmed. Not a single life was lost by our hand. Remember that fact. It is the most important detail of this entire affair. He took a deliberate step forward, his posture not one of aggression but of unwavering conviction. Do not mistake our restraint for weakness. What you witnessed was not an attack. It was a surgical procedure. We did not break your ships. We demonstrated that the nervous system connecting them had a vulnerability you refused to acknowledge. We hacked a fleet not to conquer it, but to protect the lives aboard it, both Vorlax and human, from a conflict that would have spilled needless blood across our solar system. We acted to save lives, not take them. The distinction was revolutionary, a concept that challenged the foundational logic of galactic power politics. For eons, strength had been synonymous with the capacity for destruction. To be powerful was to be able to inflict more damage than your opponent. Humanity had just introduced a new metric: control. The power to render destruction obsolete, the power to end a battle without a single funeral pyre. It was a form of strength that was far more intimidating than any doomsday weapon, because it was nuanced, precise, and implied a level of understanding so deep it bordered on the absolute. Let that be the lesson you learned today, Thorne concluded, his tone softening from declaration to profound advice. The universe is not a simple hierarchy where the strongest species dominates all others through fear. It is an infinitely complex web of connections and compatibilities. Our stone axe, as you called it, was never a weapon. It was a tool for understanding that web. It is a tool we are still willing to share, but the next time a species approaches this assembly with a humble offering, I suggest you look past the simplicity of its appearance. Look instead for the depth of the understanding it represents. For in the cosmos, the most dangerous force is not the one that shouts its power from the rooftops, but the one that listens, learns, and understands the language of the very foundations upon which your roof is built. He gave a slight, formal nod, a gesture that was neither submission nor triumph, but a simple punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had reshaped history. Then he turned and walked calmly from the chamber, leaving behind a silence that was now filled not with fear, but with the terrifying, exhilarating sound of a galaxy being forced to rethink everything it thought it knew. The invitation arrived not on a simple data slate, but carved into a crystal pillar of iridescent light, a formal summons to the innermost sanctum of the Galactic Federation. Where Ambassador Thorne had once stood as a solitary petitioner in a vast and mocking chamber, he now entered a much smaller, circular room whose walls seemed to absorb sound, a space reserved for the true architects of power. The delegates seated around the obsidian table were not the gaudy representatives of 1,000 worlds, but the austere, formidable figures of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The air hummed with a tension far heavier than mere condescension. It was the quiet, grudging acknowledgement of a fundamental shift in the cosmic order. There were no speeches, no debates. The Vorlax representative, his scales still seeming to carry the ashen pallor of defeat, merely gestured to a newly formed 6th seat at the table, its design a stark, minimalist contrast to the ornate alien thrones. The offer was not presented as a request or a negotiation. It was a statement of fact as inevitable as gravity. Earth was being offered a permanent seat on the Security Council. The species that had been a galactic joke weeks earlier was now, by unanimous and silent assent, one of the 5, now 6, pillars upon which interstellar peace and war would be balanced. This promotion was not a reward for valor. It was a strategic necessity born of sheer, unmitigated terror. The other council members looked at humanity and saw a paradox they could not solve. We possessed no fleet that could challenge their own, no planetary shields that could withstand a sustained orbital bombardment. Our strength was not quantifiable in terawatts or megahertz. It was a phantom, a ghost in the machine of reality itself. To deny us a seat was to leave us outside the system of rules and deterrence they had spent millennia building. It was to allow a wild card of unimaginable potency to operate in the shadows, unbound by treaty or convention. Bringing us inside, granting us a voice and a vote, was their only way to impose a framework upon our enigmatic power. It was an attempt to cage a concept with bureaucracy, to domesticate a storm by giving it a name and a designated path. They weren't welcoming an equal, they were institutionalizing a threat, hoping that the trappings of responsibility would temper the terrifying flexibility of human ingenuity. The second decree was even more profound, and it rippled out from that silent chamber to touch every civilized world in the Federation. The Universal Compatibility Protocol, once dismissed as a stone axe, was not merely accepted. It was mandated. By emergency legislation, it became the foundational layer for all interspecies digital communication. Every starship, every space station, every diplomatic channel was now required to integrate the UCP into its core operating systems. The tool we had created out of desperation was now the law of the galaxy. The irony was so thick it felt like a physical presence in the room. The very protocol the Vorlax had scanned, and in doing so had invited into their most sacred systems, was now being forced upon every species as a condition of participation in galactic society. It was the ultimate defensive measure born of a desperate collective fear. If everyone was using the same protocol, the thinking went, then no one could use it as a weapon against another. It was a grand, galactic pact of mutual vulnerability, a digital version of mutual assured destruction, with humanity cast in the unlikely role of both architect and enforcer. But this forced standardization created a delicious and deeply unsettling paradox for the older species. To integrate the UCP, each civilization had to open its systems to it, just as the Vorlax had. They had to allow the human-crafted code to interface with their own ancient proprietary architectures. In essence, the entire galaxy was now voluntarily undergoing the same process that had led to the Vorlax fleet's humiliation. They were handing humanity the key to their digital kingdoms, trusting that our newfound status as council members would ensure we acted as benevolent stewards. It was an act of faith on a cosmic scale, and the foundation of that faith was not friendship or trust, but the chillingly vivid memory of a hacked fleet. The peace that descended upon the galaxy was not built on a balance of power, but on a universal awareness of a shared vulnerability. Every transmission, every navigation update, every power flow regulation now passed through a filter designed by the ultimate integrators. The masters of plasma steel, the weavers of singularity drives, the shapers of dark matter, all were now bound together by the humble, relentless logic of a protocol built by a species that had never been afraid to make broken things work. The laughter had not just been silenced, it had been woven into the very fabric of their reality, a constant, silent reminder that the simplest key can open the most complex locks, provided you have the patience to understand how they work. The once dim and lonely observation deck of the Earth Embassy now hummed with a constant, low-level energy, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had defined its early days. Kaito leaned against the cool composite of the viewport, his reflection a ghostly overlay against the star-dusted tapestry of space. His eyes were not fixed on the distant, glittering heart of the galaxy, but on a single, sleek shape holding a high station orbit above Earth. It was a Vorlax light cruiser, its predatory lines softened by the distant sun's glow, its dark hull no longer a symbol of imminent threat but of a fragile, astonishing new reality. This vessel, the Stalker in Shadow, was the flagship of the newly formed Sol System Joint Patrol, and its every system, from its navigation to its life support, now ran on software vetted, and in some cases co-written by a team of human engineers. He watched as a smaller, blocky human supply shuttle drifted lazily toward the cruiser, a tiny, purposeful beetle approaching a slumbering dragon. A decade ago, such a sight would have been the premise of a hopeful science fiction novel. Now it was a Tuesday. The profound shift still sent an occasional shiver down his spine. They had not won a war, they had altered a paradigm. The laughter had been replaced by a watchful, wary respect, and in some quarters a desperate, curious hunger. The victory was not in the silencing of their mockery, but in the questions that had taken its place. The soft chime of an incoming priority one transmission broke his reverie. It was not from Ambassador Thorne or any human official. The identifier was Vorlax, but it was a personal cipher, not a military or diplomatic channel. Kaito accepted the link, and a holographic image flickered to life above his console. The face that materialized was young for a Vorlax, the scales around its eyes still possessing a subtle sheen, its black pupils wide with what could only be described as a species of anxious awe. It was Engineer Third Class Vorsk, assigned to the integration team aboard the Stalker in Shadow. The young Vorlax did not begin with a formal greeting. The protocols of his culture seemed to have been burned away by the sheer intensity of his need to know. He leaned forward, his voice a hushed, sibilant whisper, as if sharing a dangerous secret. Ambassador Kaito, he began, using the honorific title the Federation had reluctantly bestowed. There was a long pause, a battle between generations of ingrained superiority and the undeniable evidence of a superior understanding. When he spoke again, the question was not one of strategy or politics, but of pure, unadulterated intellectual thirst. The stone axe, could you teach us how it works? In that simple, halting question, Kaito heard the true end of the conflict and the hesitant beginning of everything else. It was not a request for a technical manual or a weapon schematic. It was a plea for a new way of seeing. The Vorlax had spent eons mastering the art of building taller walls and sharper spears. They understood force, precision, and power on a scale that still dwarfed human imagination. But the concept of the bridge, of the key, of the tool that creates connection instead of enforcing domination, this was a language their civilization had never needed to learn. They were masters of the fortress, but they were now humbly, fearfully asking the wandering locksmith how he picks a lock without breaking it. Kaito allowed a slow, genuine smile to touch his lips, one that held no trace of the grim satisfaction of a victor, but rather the quiet excitement of a teacher about to unveil a fundamental truth to a brilliant, if misguided, student. The stone axe was not a single tool to be explained, but a philosophy to be imparted, a history of adaptation, of failure, of making do. It was the story of humanity itself. And as he looked from the young engineer's eager face to the Vorlax warship hanging peacefully in the sky, he knew that the most important work was only just beginning. The hacking of the fleet had been a demonstration of power, but the answer to this question would be an offering